Welcome back to Infinity Outdoors Timeless Memories. As you can see, it's just me here. So, I'm going to tell a story about, I guess, a deer I've hunted for the last 2 or 3 years. And come to find out, it wasn't even the deer that I was looking for. So, what I mean by that is, there was a deer that we had for sure last year, or I'm sorry, 2 years ago. And that would have been moose horn. Now at that time, he was only about a 7 point, but the whole right side was just a mangled paddle, and it just had these little nub points that come off the top of it. And so we're going to talk about how I found out that he has siblings. Now, when I first seen this buck, I really thought, for a second that this was an injury defect, because usually I don't. Not that I don't like shooting genetic misfits, but some of those atypical bucks can turn out to be pretty interesting the longer you let them mature and get older. But we do practice some culling around here. So with that being said, we found out it was not an injury-related genetic issue. This was straight genetic problem. And as you can see, this is the great moose horn. Now, beautiful on this side, beautiful 8-point rack on this side. And on this side, it looks like he's growing symmetrically to his G2 here, but there's something going on here. And it did not fully develop, it did not grow right. So with that in mind, I have to believe that this is actually a genetic misfit of sort, because this is not moose paddle. Like I said, this is moose horn. He's just got a straight slick beam on one side, a straight up weapon, a dagger. So when I saw him for the first time, that would have been early October. So just after bow season started, somewhere between like the 16th and the 20th is when I saw him. But I saw him with what I'm assuming is a relative deer, whether it be brother or cousin, and it would have been moose paddle hanging out with this guy. And after we had seen them on camera, we never saw them again. I hunted relentlessly for moose paddle, but I didn't know I was going to end up seeing old moose horn here. And so, I was up in the morning and out there midday and hunting the afternoons really hard to find this guy. And so, I guess when he finally stepped out, it was such an odd day. It wasn't even, I guess, the quote-unquote pristine conditions for a bow hunter. It was probably like 5 to 10 mile an hour winds, and it was blowing right at my face, so everything was going towards my back. And that's actually where he came from, was from my back, which was a very odd position for the deer to come from, which, scouting throughout the season, 90% of the time, they would come from in my front left or my front right. Now, to put it in directional terms, they would have come from my south or they would have come from my north. Nothing ever came from my west, which was very odd already. But he did start by coming from my north. And when he was chasing does and, hot on their tail, they ended up circling all the way up from behind me on my west side. And I guess in the heat of the moment, they weren't worried about scent, which I find really weird, because this deer, or those two brother deers, have always been consistently skittish. They're very in tune with what's going on around them. So for him to have made that mistake, in the rut, anything can happen, and those boys end up, becoming pretty sloppy. But this was a pretty big mistake. So it was 5 to 10 mile an hour winds, like I said, blowing from east to west, or more like southeast, northwest. I want to say it was also like in the high 40s that day too. Like, it wasn't even that cold either, and it wasn't overcast. The sun was out. So it was just a very odd day when it came to the weather pattern that day. When he finally came out, like I said, he wrapped around from north to south, but he came around the back side of me, that west side, and came up this kind of gradual cliffside that came out of a swamp and into this open, just kind of like buckwheat field almost. And he was chasing 3 does, and I got a glimpse of him, and he just took off. And from there, he continued on eastward towards the, like a maple forest, a maple thicket. And so I hung my bow back up, and I thought it was over. And when he came back, I had my grunt in my hand, and I was thinking about calling at him to kind of challenge him a little bit. But when he spun those 3 does around, and they come flying into the short end of the food plot, the corner which I was sitting on, I was out looking at the short end of this food plot, and they come darting in, and he was really like skeptical about it. It was like he didn't want to be in that food plot, and so he kind of stayed there. I could see him licking his nose and trying to catch a wind of something, and he was really just paying attention to the detail of what was going on around him visually, looking at all the different possible, entryways and exits, coming into this food plot that I was sitting. And after about 5 minutes of him thinking about it and watching his does sit there and mill around in this food plot, he took a couple steps in, went up to a mock scrape that I had made underneath a pine tree right there on the edge, dividing my food plot and this other field of this tall grass. And he dug out, a little bit of that mock scrape. And the second he turned his body, and he was quartered to me. So for those of you who don't know what that is, which I'm sure most of you do know, he was angled where his head was closest to me and his ass end was a little bit further. And the second he quartered to me, I pulled back, and it was like immediately after I pulled back, he took one step with that outside leg, giving me a complete open cavity here to have a shot right behind his shoulder. And sure enough, let that arrow fly. And I think he only ran about 50 yards before dropping. But man, was that a big deer. When I aged him, he was somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5, based on what I found on his lower jaw and his teeth. So I want to say he also weighed about 190, maybe 200 on the hoof. And the fun part was I had no buddies around at the time, so I got to drag this guy by myself. So that was great. It was a workout, but I mean, it's pretty fulfilling, especially after I walked up to him. And of course, after I shot him, I called my dad, because we had been talking about hunting this guy for years. And, we waited for him to mature up and everything, because we didn't want to take him while he was super young. And there were other bucks out there at the time in prior years. So when I told him I got him, I told him I got moose paddle, because I had really thought that this was moose paddle and that something had happened and some tines broke and what have you. But when I got up to him, I was looking at him closer. This was not there was no break. As you can tell, there are no breaks on this set of antlers. It was like this just grew and stopped growing, and this kept going. So in moose paddle himself, this right here was much thicker in the base, and it had about 3 or 4 points coming off of it. So it looked like almost like a pine tree on this side. And so when we discovered that, we went back to some of the pictures that we had of both of them. And sure enough, I'll show you guys here in a second. And sure enough, you can tell that there are very minute but definitive differences between the two bucks. And so now, coming up now in springtime here, and getting ready for everything and the new season to roll around, I'm pretty sure that we will possibly see moose paddle again. That excites me, because there were 3 altogether. These 2 I knew were related in some way because of the way they grew. Is very, very similar. But there is a third one, and that's bullhorn. And it's essentially the same thing. So he's only got one tine, but instead of it being his G2 that's grown, it's just his main beam. So if you can picture this main beam without either one of his main tines here, that's what this side looks like. So it makes me wonder if there's a genetic pool going around and there's a couple of these deer that look like this around here. But like I said, we try and cull out these misfits and these genetic defects, even though it's almost impossible to monitor that because we only hunt on about 70 acres of land, so we can only catch them in small windows of time. And as most of you probably know, bucks can travel anywhere from 5 to 25 miles at a time when it comes to the rut season, and they're just moving to breed. They only get to do that one time of the year, so they're not going to waste any time, and they'll go to great lengths to be able to spread their seed and reproduce. So I mean, this buck is a really interesting buck, really interesting story that goes behind it, and it makes me interested to see if his brother or cousin or whatever deer it is that's related to this, and they may even have no relation at all, but there is some sort of genetic pool that is going around that has got these deer looking like this. But I did want to take the time today to share the story of how this deer came to light, and I did that for two reasons. One, this is just a really odd deer, really unique deer, and it being as old as it was makes me wonder why we haven't seen it until now. And again, trying to develop reasoning that this deer in specific is related to moose horn, or sorry, moose paddle. And two is that when it comes to rut season, your target buck will become something that you see one time and you take it that one chance you've got. So I don't like it, or I shouldn't say that. I don't particularly care for people who pick a buck out and stick with it and hunt only that deer, because there are plenty of other bucks that, like I said, will be traveling great lengths to get to an area where doe are in estrus and he is ready to reproduce. And so don't ever limit yourself to one deer or to one buck that you've seen that you think will be a great wall hanger. I'm also not a huge fan of the ideology that you're supposed to shoot something really big and hang it on the wall. I personally like to see all these pretty big deer, running around and reproducing, because that will just lead to more of those big pretty deer running around and more hunting opportunity for someone who doesn't necessarily get to hunt all the time. I've been pretty blessed in the last couple of years to have the opportunity to hunt as much as I have, but that won't be my life forever. So I want to be able to know that at least here I'm doing my due diligence and just trying to get big body deer and trying to fill the freezer with meat. And of course, like I said, we tend to stick to the whole idea of culling. So we take out those really weird scrubs, those odd deer that just don't fit right in the genetic gene pool that we want to have around here. But anyway, like I said, that's pretty much all I have today. But like I said, I wanted to share this story of this buck because it is just a really pretty deer, freaking monster. But I mean, I put this up to an Illinois deer that I had come in here that my friend was showing me, and this 5.5-year-old was supposed to be an 8-point, but that Illinois 10-point, almost a shame. So I mean, as much as a monster he is, you'd never think it because of this, but he does have a wicked tail, and I probably won't ever forget this hunt because, like I said, I hunted for a specific deer, never saw it, and this guy just stepped out once. Never seen him prior except for that once on picture, on camera, like early October, and that was in the middle of the night. And I get to hold his head in my hands today. And, he tells a great story. So, like I said, that's all I have for you today. So, thanks for watching Infinity Outdoors Timeless Memories, and I'll catch you on the next one.